Hello there, let's explore game theory and power dynamics without an agenda of trying to show what we want to show and believing what we want to believe. So let's see how the game is played. And truly, one of the main lessons of mainstream game theory is that tit-for-tat is such an okay system. And gotta keep in mind that when it comes to morality, we are kind of like disregarding it. We're just kind of considering trading my potatoes for your carrots or something. And we are benefiting from the advantage together. And here you can make the argument that people are incentivized to play with those who play tit-for-tat with them. But is that really the takeaway here? Because assuming that you kind of play tit-for-tat by first kind of giving, at least extending some trust, that would imply the best strategy would be steal from everyone, especially if you can steal again, and especially if you have a lot of players who you can steal from. Let's say, for sake of argument, that if you stole like 10,000 times, then you would be set for life, right? And you have 8 billion players, right? Tit-for-tat would be for total suckers. Why would you care about that? Just steal from everyone. And in this case, we are kind of assuming equal power, although this might work even in cases you have less power, as long as you can get away with stealing. So, albeit we are putting in the category of equal, oftentimes this is done with advantage, but regardless, the strategy is steal from everyone and capitalize yourself. You can argue that AI is kind of doing this. Oh, no doubt, the AI companies, they just steal from everyone, everything they can, and they just capitalize with their AI, which they're trying to sell, right? But you see this every single time. If you can steal, you should steal. Now, of course, in the case of knowledge, or possibly like a book or something, that doesn't mean that you are kind of taking away their stuff, but it does hurt their relative position. And we're going to circle back to that, because let's suppose, for sake of argument, I was the only guy who could fix roofs. I would be charging a fortune. But if there are millions more who can do that, then probably not. Stealing from everyone is even more viable in the, well, I guess the age of the internet, and especially the age of the goldfish, because people might just steal from others and like gotta come back in like a year and they're gonna steal again. And especially gonna work best if others don't have much of a choice, but that could be in the realm of power here. So ideally, tit-for-tat would be positive sum, but steal from everyone and capitalize yourself? Now that is light years better. Yet, what about power? And at that point, we need to consider power asymmetry and what effect it really has on the distribution. So, I guess the naive, extremely naive, beyond naive assumption would be that there is no power asymmetry. But this is pretty much never the case, or power symmetry has no effect on the distribution, which could be relative to the power balance or absolute. This is kind of like winner takes all, while relative would be kind of like winner takes more, essentially. And in the case of absolute, any kind of advantage, whether essentially more advantage possibly counts for less, so it's kind of logarithmic, still results in the person kind of taking everything. So you might see in let's say just a tournament. I'm using it as just a very simple example. So one player might be like 2% better or like 5% better than the other player. It does not matter because they take everything. But in this case, this will be all skill. And oftentimes, power does not come from skill and what you know, but actually money you have. So suppose an employer would probably not have absolute advantage compared to their employee, but they definitely have relative advantage, and they would not even hire an employee unless they're getting more out of it. Yet it's very important to realize how that game really evolves over time. Because let's suppose that I had a casino, and I had like the house had the odds of like 55% of winning. So everyone who plays that game makes the casino richer and only increases the advantage of the casino, and everyone else will be eventually in abject poverty. Now you might say that, oh, it wasn't too bad. I made some money for some time. It does not matter because the relative advantage of your competitor actually just got better. So essentially, you're just burning yourself. And the more their power is in their favor, the worse the deal gets. So day one, you might show up and you get 4 coins and they get 6 coins, you know? But year one, right? Year two, it's gonna be like you get 2 coins and they get 8 coins. And year 10, you're only gonna get bread or something. Because what else are you gonna do? So if you play games where others are favored, then you will get dominated and ultimately you will be an abject slave essentially. The only exception would be if power asymmetry is not really constant. So for example, if A dominates B, but B dominates C, but C dominates A, then they're kind of like balanced in a way that they're kind of like dominating each other in different ways, I suppose. But suppose if A dominates B and C, then it's GG. Let's just circle back to power symmetry here though. So you might say that linear, and this is seemingly how many think, is not that unfair. So suppose you ran a race and some guy had like 5 laps of advantage on you. Suppose you ran like 1,000 more laps, they would have 1,005 laps and you would have 1,000 laps. So this is not that bad. This would be even better if it's logarithmic, so essentially increased efforts have reduced returns. But still, I must emphasize that this still does not help you catch up. And if the game is absolute domination, then it really does not matter. Even if like 1% just results in absolute domination and winner takes all, then that's it. And in games, you often see the reverse one, or you just some kind of bounce back mechanic. Yeah, that mostly exists in games, but there could be areas where an advantage actually confers disadvantages, or proportionally a disadvantage. So, for example, these days, if you have a lot of money, you're probably feeling pretty dang good about it. But suppose there was a group that called itself the Scales of Justice or something, who went after boys who have the higher score, then you might be finding it somewhat of a disadvantage. Of course, not to the point where you might get rid of it, but it would be something that would give you pause. Of course, you might go for something that, like, I don't know, you hit the gym or something, and you're like, yeah, that's gonna help you lift heavier stuff, but realistically, that's not gonna help you in many other areas in your life. So, for example, if you're gonna go for a run, then being buff as hell is probably not gonna help. And of course, many times, your advantage might have no effects, or possibly no relevance. But of course, it depends on how widely it applies. So money would very, very widely apply. Yet, unfortunately these days, and this is why many feel like that the games are brutally rigged, although this is just kind of how it works out, is that advantages tend to be exponential or they compound. So the more you have, the more you have, and the more you have, the more you get. So the guy who has an advantage not only is getting more faster, but also, very often, taking more from you, or taking all from you. So suppose you had like $100 billion, you can just sit on that, right? You can just invest that, you can just pat yourself on the back for being such a responsible person. Yet, who's making your money? It is other people. So you're living on your slavings, essentially. So people might not think that it is domination, but it absolutely is. And it will be, as long as people accept it, right? And there's nothing they can do outside of not playing the game or rising up. They literally have 2 ways of countering it. One would be change the game, if they can, if they have the power, almost certainly not, but they can try to. And second would be kill you. Now, I'm not saying this as an advocate, I'm just saying it as a fact. But what about value here? So you might hear negative sum, zero sum, positive sum. Of course, positive sum is really exalted as the good option because you generate more for humanity. And rightfully so. Yet, for a self-interested agent, that really does not matter. In fact, that might just make things worse. Because let's suppose, for example, that the other person had 0 points and you had 100 points. So good. But for sake of argument, then you had some kind of game or some kind of system that added everyone 1,000 points. So they're going to have 1,000 points and you're going to have 1,100 points. Is this something good? No. This absolutely totally fucked your power balance. Just to make it even clearer, let's say that whatever money you have right now, everyone on Earth right now would receive $10 trillion, right? Would this be something that you would be happy with? So essentially, this would mean that it pretty much would not matter how much money you have right now because everyone would just have $10 trillion and you would essentially have equality, no doubt, heavy inflation. But my point is, you don't really care about you getting $10 trillion, but your relative value, your relative power would be hurt. So if you have 10 million right now, you might feeling pretty good about that. But if your neighbor got 10 trillion and everyone else got 10 trillion, you got 10 trillion too, you would not like that. Of course, in this case, you might not call it positive sum. Yet it absolutely can be the case. So let's suppose you may have a house or not right now, but suppose everyone had a house. Now, if you had some rental properties, then how are you gonna live off people right now? You can't. It's not gonna happen. So this absolutely fuck with you. So exploitation is dependent on, well, a power imbalance, but also scarcity. You want people to not have stuff. So while it would be true that positive sum makes the most sense for a rational species, that suppose would just share stuff, just get things done and share it, but for a self-interested agent, maybe not. And many games out there are entirely zero sum. If I get it, you can get it. But also if I get more of it, then you get less of it. But also keep in mind, if it's a game about relative advantage, then what would make the most sense for a self-interested agent that you get as much of it as possible, and if you cannot get the rest, then you destroy it. Suppose you're running a business. What makes the most sense? That you, along with all your competitors, are making as much money as possible, right? And they are getting stronger compared to you? No, you want them all into the red, essentially. You want them gone. You might see this in war. Like, what do? They just burn the food. It's like, why would they burn the food, man? That could be positive value for the other humans, or at least zero sum. And you see this all the fucking time. That people might go for negative sum games. Especially see this from the rich. Because power is relative. So if they might go for policies that kind of suck for them, but also sucks for you, then that improves that relative advantage. So for example, why would you go for massive tariffs on your own country? To impoverish the populace. You want them weak. You want to improve your position. You want them desperate. So when it comes to sum, there are mainly two ways of looking at it. One would be the rational, let's just make as much stuff as we can and share it. And the somewhat self-centered is that you take as much as you can and you want others to have as little as possible. And this gives you the maximum leverage, the maximum power balance in your favor. So a company might do some research or write some code and they can just release it. Why not just release it? That's gonna be easily a positive sum for humanity, right? Why not do it? Because it's gonna suck for them. Not only they don't do that, but they actually spend a ton of money to screw with their main competitors. So a naive way of looking at it would be like, let's say that you had like 10 runners and they are like, oh, gotta work together so we can run faster or something, right? And you gotta teach the other runners to run even faster than you, right? Because all that really matters is that collectively you all have the best time or something. Well, if you want to win, you might not do this. You might just be concerned with your own time. And if you can make sure that the others have broken legs or something, or just gone, then that would be in your favor. Now, it's still true that negative sum is usually not really worth it. Because let's say that if you lose and they lose too, then you just have two losers essentially, and everyone who really stayed out of it is essentially the winner. But zero sum is oftentimes, well, first of all, it is very common out there, but also, unfortunately, it might be the best in many contexts. So when it comes to value, it really does matter how much value can you really capture. And you might say that, oh, I'm just gonna be a good guy. I'm gonna be the one who's like making like open source contributions for humanity, and that's truly gonna lead to the most positive outcome for most people. And that is 100% true. But this often, due to our incentives, in our world often leads to steal from everyone and capitalize yourself. So this is what you often see, because it makes sense out of self-interest. So, for example, if you just decided to run some kind of a farm that just gives away food for free for people or whatever, then you would be really stepping on the toes of everyone who wants to sell food. Just wanna... Although this is more of a flawed example, because in that case, it would have continued costs. But still kind of a good example, because you do see that despite the costs of actually growing that food and whatever, farms actually burn the food, right? Because if they didn't, then they would still end up with, you know, that amount of unsold food, but they would also drive down the cost of their produce, essentially. So if you're a farmer, when the farms of others burn, you celebrate. It sucks for the people. It sucks for your competitors, I suppose. But it's great for you, even if you have to buy the gasoline yourself. And assuming self-interested agents, they will rig every single game out there in their favor. Even if they make the game quote-unquote fair, if they come into it with an advantage, then it's not really fair. So they have a fair game, but like, oh, I just happen to have like, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, man. But otherwise, it's all up to effort or something. And ultimately, you can ask yourself, how do you win rigged games? And the answer is that you don't. You can't. And you can consider luck here. So let's just bring up the casino, for example. You might get lucky. Some might get lucky. But the game is rigged. If you keep playing that game, you will always lose over time. Most people will lose badly over time. It almost doesn't matter how badly the game is rigged. Even if it's rigged a little bit, the likely outcome that others will end up with everything and you will end up with nothing. And one element that we must also consider, that agents are oftentimes not free to choose. So you're not really free to choose things that you need or possibly very greatly desire. Are you free to not eat food, for example? If I dropped Elon Musk in the desert and I offered to sell him a water bottle for all his money, would he be free to not choose that? Yes, you have a freedom to die. That's it. So power, what really leads to is that they steal and they force you to give, and your only other options would be that you kill yourself or you fight, which might lead to the very same outcome. So if you just looked at it naively and said that, you know, let's say that one person, you know, does 10 work, gets 10 reward, and the other person does, you know, 7 work and gets 7 reward. That's fine, right? That's not a problem. But the problem really arises when you can use whatever advantages you have, to dominate. Especially if these advantages compound or absolute. By the way, there is no such thing as passive resistance. So suppose you had a casino that, let's just say that you don't like, right? If you just left them alone, then they would just get richer and more powerful and richer and more powerful. Even if you are starving on the streets and you consider yourself a rebel, are you winning? You're just dominated and powerless. So suppose in that case, even if we are looking at it with reduced choices, your best choice would be starting your own casino, if it works out, and burn their casino down to the ground. And make them pay, well, playing yours. Of course, that almost certainly would be a fantasy in a situation where the power advantage is not in your favor. But at the very least, you should be under no illusion that this is a life or death competition. And all they care about is using you to the max, and then seeing you perish when you're useless. And when it comes to voting and permissions, generally the rule is that if you need to ask, the answer is no. They have a power advantage because they like it that way. They have the stuff because they like it that way. They have the status because they like it that way. So there could be a fantasy that others are just not know things. And if you only enlighten them, then you would have your way, right? But that is not the case. They don't care, or they very much do like it. And they may not even believe this. They might believe other things. It doesn't matter. What matters is what ends up happening. You should never, ever, 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 ever trust what people say. I know, this sounds a little distrustful, but you should be using your eyeballs as much as possible. Truly, some are non-bullshitters, and that is very much appreciated. But if your eyeballs are not telling you the same thing as their mouth, then you should be trusting their words, right? Just kidding. Your eyeballs. A somewhat even more cynical way of looking at it would be that it is all just kind of like a play or a ploy for soft power. They just try to say things because making noises with your mouth is cheap. So others like you more. Or very easily, you can just promise people things and get paid now. I mean, that is what advertising is. So people might not think about this, and it's very normalized these days. But what essentially is advertising? People might, well, the advertising bros might tell you a bunch of bullshit, but essentially I'm trying to manipulate the person to be aligning with my self-interest. Now you might be saying like, oh yeah, no, I just want to do them solid. Oh, bullshit. There could be like other millions of products. I don't care. I just want to sell my stuff, right? Is my product literally the best? Well, that would be such a privileged position because let's say my product is literally the best, right? And I just inform them about it and they buy. And sure, you might believe this, but oftentimes that is not the case. Even if you would argue that if they had your product, then it would be a positive development for them. Sure, but would it be the most positive development for them? Because you don't care, right? Or rather, I should say that businesses don't care. They just want to sell their stuff. So while we started with equality here, that would be somewhat naive. Almost certainly there is going to be some kind of power symmetry, which often leads to some kind of domination and social hierarchy. Social hierarchy actually means that if you can position yourself higher on the social hierarchy, then you get to demand more stuff. One of the reasons the crab bucket mentality could be so prevalent is because suppose you don't think you can improve your position, or you actually can't, then one of the ways to actually preserve your position in a way is that you keep others down. And people will actually say things all the time to try to fuck with you, to try to subtly dig at you, to possibly try to establish some kind of subservient mindset for you, some kind of helplessness for you. Maybe they just try to make you believe that they care about you, but they don't, because it's always words. They might give you some good advice, which is the equivalent of go fuck yourself when it comes to some kind of help. If something is heavy, they're just gonna tell you that, hey, have you tried lift a thing 2 times harder or something? But ultimately, the guy who has like 10 million does not want you to get like 10 trillion, right? And just dominate them. So they're gonna tell you bullshit like, hey, you know how you're gonna get rich? By working harder for me. In fact, that is a very prevailing view at times. Most often echoed with the saying that the rising tide lifts all boats. How much of a bullshit that is. And you do see this a lot, that those who are in certain positions, let's just say that, they might have certain beliefs that really go along with that. In fact, people oftentimes just believe in their self-interest. And essentially what they want to believe in. But regardless, that saying would perfectly exemplify that people don't really want to compromise their position. They want to improve their position, while others might get to improve their position as well, somewhat, but not really their ranking. So you get to make $100 if they make, 1,000. Of course, this game would lead to the ultimate conclusion that you become their abject slave, but of course they don't care. If you look at organizations, then you can see that it is pretty much a game of trying to capture the value of others. It is very rare these days that you actually get to capture fully your own value. I'm not even saying that it would be desirable for society. That's not really the angle I'm considering here. So we can certainly argue for more of a collective sharing something system. Yet someone dominating you and them capturing your value against your interest and against the interest of society would be undesirable. What are you going to do about it? And you gotta keep in mind that it's very much against the interest of those who want to capture your value to kind of let you do that. So that's why you can't really have farmers. That's why the land of all the farmers was taken away. Because let's suppose that someone had a casino. And this, let's just say for sake of argument, a 2-player game. But you just have your own farm. You're just doing your thing. You're just farming, capturing your value, doing the thing. And this is kind of bad. So what they're going to wish for is that you did not have the farm. Then you have to play in their casino, right? Even having a coalition of farmers, essentially, would be very different from one guy owning the farm and dominating everyone else to work on that, and essentially taking as much as they can from them. So really all domination trend towards slavery. Because they don't have much of a choice, and you take as much as you can. Let us suppose, for a second, and for sake of argument, that fighting is out of the question. You just have a system that is entirely dominating. You can take, and they can only give. And let us suppose there are no other options, then that's it. Which is kind of what you would see with machines. We make the machines and they work for us, essentially. And suppose we consider it with a human, and let's say, for sake of argument, that rising up is completely out of the question, then the only way to opt out would be just to kill themselves, right? Or you can argue some kind of ineffectual resistance that essentially results in the same thing. So essentially, you have a game that is obey or die. Of course, if they are extremely willful, then you would have a problem. Because how do you make someone play such a game? Imagine if they never, ever relented, and they would also always pick fight to the bitter end over any kind of obedience. Or rather, I say false obedience, because they would not be obeying out of self-interest or something. And here is where we come to teaching people to think right and dominating their spirit. Because let me suppose that you are stronger, but if people are only obeying you when you're actively punching them, that kind of has limited utility. But you can very easily see that many people hold beliefs and do actions that are not in their best interest. And this is not because they are stupid, but possibly because they don't have a choice. And they are kind of indoctrinated. But also one important aspect that we really should touch on is that oftentimes the spirit of those who are at the lower end of the dominance hierarchy is dominated. And people don't really talk about this topic, and I must. So why are people helpless? Why are people depressed? Why are people lacking ambition? Well, this is all a result of what you would see. Because if you had some kind of game where those who lose out never, ever relent, they always fight relentlessly, then hierarchies would be somewhat tricky to maintain. Because you would see this in the animal kingdom, that you might see, like, especially males fighting out, and, one gets dominated, and now they kind of have some kind of a subservient mindset. They know their place, and they're gonna act like it. And oh boys, humans do this too. In fact, compared to animals, we are in another galaxy. The actions of people, the words of people, this is all just jockeying for status, try to make themselves look good, try to dig at you, trying to possibly sabotage you. I wish I could not see it. Maybe I wish I was stupider. It is also everywhere. What people say, the media, the schools, the books, and the media, TV shows, movies, it is everywhere. Because society is essentially just a collective make-believe, and where you rank and what you have is just in your head, and just in the head of others. So you have to believe it, and you have to make others believe it too. Or you have nothing. Can you be the king? Just on your own? Can I just like put on a spiky hat and I'm gonna say like, oh yeah, all of you are my bitch or something? Would it work? No. I have to act like a total jerk. Just like, oh yeah, I have stuff and you don't have stuff, and I like a total dick and they're gonna take it because I'm the king, bitch. You must give me respect. And you must bend the knee before me because I'm the king or whatever, right? This means nothing in reality, but it does mean everything to me because it is something that confers me advantages. So you can see that especially people who very much rely on perception for their position very much kind of act it out. They might act like dicks, or possibly they kind of like braggy as like, oh, look at me, I'm so good, or something like that. Because suppose no one knew, and let's say that you didn't have anything that you might believe that you have, and you were just walking around in plain clothes, you would be not treated special. Others would not bend their knees to you. Yeah, personally, I find it less interesting that how fucked in the head those who believe they deserve to have it better really think and what they believe, but how most people really conditioned and programmed and indoctrinated to take it and accept their place. Because you couldn't have a slave unless you also make them a slave in their mind. Otherwise, you would need to absolutely just whip them, punch them all the fucking time to do your bidding, right? Power asymmetry would mean for nothing if people would pick death and would fight relentlessly. But it's also important to reiterate and emphasize that most of the time, power is just in your head. And this is just what you believe. So, for example, if I believe I have some dirt, or I believe I have some status, then what is that, right? It is just something that makes me crazy. I'm a crazy person. I only have it if I can convince people that I have it. Imagine if I said that I own all the air and you better pay me like at least $10 a month so you get to breathe air. And if you don't agree with me, I guess in this case, I'm just gonna fucking nuke you. Now, I imagine that before my threat of nuking you, you probably didn't care that much about it. Which really exemplifies that, sure, belief only goes so far. Almost certainly, belief is backed by force and violence. So, in OG times, you probably were not really free to believe in religion, or at least not free to pretend that you believe in it, right? Which could be the same thing. I fucking love the Jesus, man. Hell yeah, man. Give me a cross or something. I say this because I don't want to get burned on it. And the rulers are highly incentivized that this spreads because it spreads. And very important here, goes back to dominate their spirit, a subservient mindset. Of course, the church would be extremely incentivized as well because it is their power. It is how they have relevance. So, unfortunately, the answer of why people have depression, why people have helplessness, is because others gave it to them. Because this would be not your game, you're just a pawn in someone else's. And you might argue some kind of a societal collaboration, and I'm not against that, but you gotta look at all the pieces on the board. So you might be equal with many other pieces, or possibly have it better than some pieces, but many other pieces have it much better than you, and their claim to dominance is weak. Almost every single case, even if you might argue that some kind of make it, and they can like rise up with their own value, their kids kind of live off that. So ultimately, eventually, what really comes down to is that almost everyone has a false claim to status. And especially because their claim is false, they want to keep it. And when it comes to hierarchy, it solely might not seem like in history, because how strong can really one guy can get, right? not that strong. So you need to share some kind of value, and you gotta share power, essentially, to kind of dominate possibly even most people, but you just cannot have one guy who's just dominating everything. Yet, with the advent of AI and robots, this might not be true, because every kind of hierarchy, or possibly every kind of game, kind of trends toward one winner. So suppose you could have one guy who has like all the robots, just owns everything, then they can be God, and everyone else is their slave. Yet what I'm really getting at here, that if you are in part of a game where others are kind of taking your stuff, your value, maybe it's gonna be a long-running one, but possibly it's gonna take hundreds of years to play it out, but eventually it's gonna lead to absolute domination. So you might have some guy who's telling story that they work for their boss, and when they did, they had like one store. But by the time their kid grows up, then that one guy has like 200 stores. And you know who that made that happen? You. You gave them all the power. And they're gonna dominate your kid harder. And possibly your kid gonna work for them as well. And their kid, assuming they even get to have one, might be working for a very dominant company that might have like, who knows, like 20,000 stores or something. And you are the one who made it happen. So suppose a very simple game. You had one guy who claims to own dirt, and another guy who possibly is gonna bend the knee, and let's call it the slave. Who's gonna buy the next slave? It is the slave, right? Because the slave is working for the master, and they are gonna buy the next slave, and the next, and the next, and the next, and there's gonna be a massive operation, all funded by the slave, because they didn't have the fucking balls. And they're definitely not good. Whatever you define as good, they're definitely not that. And really, I don't really have much of a solution to that, because if, let's say, that you don't play the games of others, then you might make your own games, but will you not rig your own games as well? Because almost certainly people do. In rare cases, they make their games fair, but they kind of give themselves an advantage. But in most cases, they just rig their games. And they can call it whatever, it doesn't matter. Personally speaking, I would like to see more incentives toward positive-sum games. Because currently, we definitely don't have that. If I was a farmer, my best incentive would be just to get as much as I can and burn everyone else's farm. That is the game. And of course, I wouldn't want to be a dickless slave working on someone else's farm. That's for sure. At that point, you're not even a player. You're just one of the pawns. You would be capital. You're one of the animals. Nothing else. And by the way, I'm not even necessarily advocating here stealing, but just to make value and capture that value and take that value, you would need to have your own game. Because if you play that game for someone else, they will do, assuming they're a self-interested agent, everything they can do to capture as much of it as they can. And possibly my last point would be, do whatever it takes to win. So I'm completely, at least when it comes to games, I'm disregarding any kind of morality, good, and whatever bullshit that kids might tell themselves or be told to kids or taught to people. Now, certainly, we cannot disregard power imbalance. But what you see a lot is that you might have something that society might label as a loser who pats themselves on the back for being good, but they are just weak. And dominated. Even if we consider good here, good would be doing a massive solid for humanity, not being dominated, not being useless. Good would be promoting positive-sum games and uplifting people. Now, of course, from the perspective of a self-interested agent, that would not be your incentive. Your incentive would be just to stomp them into the ground. Which is exactly what we see people doing. Or possibly look the other way when it happens. If we circle back to the first game of the tit-for-tat, that theoretically should start by giving, if we consider power here, and especially absolute power, a domination, then by giving even once, you would resign yourself to abject slavery. So, in a game theory sense, the takeaway would be there's nothing you wouldn't do, and never relent. Now, I got some good and bad news. This doesn't mean that it's all domination. People do collaborate, usually to even dominate harder together. Yet, I would make a distinction between cooperation and domination here. Because you might say that the peasant is cooperating with the king or something, but I might argue that the peasant is dominated by the king. They wouldn't willfully obey, and they wouldn't willfully just have less. And if given the choice, they would probably pick the better pawn. Yet, they don't have a choice. Now, ideally, this does not apply to all you know, but especially among those you are not close with, it could be true, possibly to describe them as they're looking to gain and see you as their means. And it can be extremely divorced in our lives. Like, I buy a shirt. Do I really think about how this shirt came to be? When I buy some kind of food in the supermarket, do I really think about it? When I buy a computer, do I really think about it, how the components came to be? Suppose I hired someone to fix my radiator. Do I really think about that person? So sure, some might appreciate you as their end, but most seemingly just see you as their means and only care what they can get from you. And I'm not saying this is a sad thing, but something that is very easy to observe, and suppose you don't accept this, that might make you sad. But when it comes to game theory, sure, it deals with interest, but does it deal with power? And I would very much argue that you cannot divorce interest from power. Because power would be your ability to manifest your interest. And big part of our power these days would be completely imaginary. I have it as long as I can convince people that I have it. Suppose there would be no record of it, I cannot convince anyone of it, then I don't have power, right? So, for that example, let's just say that I was the king, right? I am the king as long as others believe that I'm the king. That is my power, in a way. Or, for sake of argument, I was God. Even if no one thinks that I'm God, I'm still God. And my power is absolute. I don't need anyone to worship me. I don't need anyone to obey me. They probably would. Not because they're good or whatever, but out of their self-interest. They're gonna be like, oh God, please give me just $10 or something, right? No one's gonna pray to me like, hey God, what's up? How's it going lately? No one cares about that. Hey God, my son is sick. Please help him. Or, hey God, I need some money. Hey God, why no rain lately? Give me some rain. Everyone only hits me up if they need something. And the rule of every game, which was pretty much hinted on do whatever it takes to win, is that aggression wins. The most competitive, the most selfish players win and reproduce in greater numbers. Now, you might like to hear the sound of that, but I'm just reporting on it, and this is the obvious conclusion. And keep in mind, this does not mean that they are stupid. So assuming that the game is hard to dominate, then they will be forced to play more legit, so to speak. Oddly enough, it would be more trending toward tit-for-tat. And you might see this between like two very aggressive, crafty, brutal businessmen and like, you know, what's in it for me and what's in it for me. And essentially they end up with a tit-for-tat. Not out of some love for fairness, no doubt, but because it is the best thing they can take. And oftentimes people's definition of fairness usually just means that they get to have more. So when they rage about fairness, they possibly could be raging about things that could improve their position. So they are really focused on that. So what would be very self-serving. But in ways that they are fine, or possibly have it better, they don't rage about that. Of course, a bit of a flaw with the aggression leaning, you might argue, that it tends to favor zero-sum games, because the only thing better than you're gaining is your opponent going totally broke. Also, and when it comes to positive, they want to capture the whole thing. And certainly it would be true, and this seems self-evident, that if value was distributed more equally, then it would also lead to, well, even if we ignore any humanistic considerations, it would lead to more value being generated in the future. Because let's say that you had your citizens all educated, living in houses, buying food and whatnot. Then they are almost certainly gonna provide more value than if they were just dirt poor on the streets or in the dirt and picking up plastic bottles or something. But suppose if you approach it from the perspective of a self-serving agent, then not only you don't care, but this is a positive development for you because their relative power compared to you is just nothing. But when it comes to the overall power of a country, for example, then this would be an extremely negative development. So, for example, food companies might be extremely incentivized personally, so everyone just buys as much food as possible and pays as much as possible. But a country would suffer greatly from having a bunch of fat people. But of course, if you just look at healthcare, then a rational country would not want a bunch of fat people. But if you're just looking to make money with healthcare, then you want people to be as unhealthy as possible. So personal interest is very often at odds with positive sum. And again, this could be the crab in the bucket or whatever. Negative sum itself can be extremely valuable too, because let's say that you had a farm, and let's say that you cannot improve your position whatsoever. Just by burning down the farm of others, you get to profit like crazy. And generally people would not pick such games unless they are already winning or possibly think they can win. So suppose you were a slave, you probably would not advocate for slavery. But probably you would be a bigger fan if you own slaves. So that's about it. I did not make the game. I'm just telling you how it works. And I personally would love to see more cooperative positive sum, but this is against the interest of some, yet very much could be the best interest of many. Alright, see ya.